Hello, folks. This is Joseph P. Farrell with part two of Operation Bernhard and my little video blog series on this topic in relationship to the bearer bonds scandal. And yesterday I ended by noting that it's my supposition that Operation Bernhard, number one, was a crucial component by 1943 of the Nazi strategic evacuation plans, and that number two, it probably continued in some scaled down form after the war as the SS acquired the counterfeiting knowledge from the counterfeiters that they had working for them from the concentration camps. As the SS acquired the knowledge of counterfeiting currencies and so on and so forth, that this operation very probably may have continued on a scaled down form after the war as a component of the Nazi strategic evacuation plans. Now, the reason I'm suggesting this hypothesis is related to the bearer bonds scandal, which many of you know I've been fascinated with ever since the story broke, and I've blogged about it several times over the past year and a half. Now, if you go to the bearer bonds stories, one of the interesting things that keeps recurring as a theme over and over again is that the bonds that are supposedly fake or supposedly counterfeit have been of such good quality that it's very, very difficult to distinguish them from the genuine article, with one significant exception. And that exception is that in many cases, these bearer bonds are issued in denominations that were never officially issued, and note the word officially, or that they contain other little errors. And I blogged on April 26th in the News and Views from the Nefarium that I found information that in fact leads me to believe that this was actually an intentional scam. In other words, that governments did issue bonds in strange denominations or with strange style of paper, or with little errors intentionally, so that if they were ever tried to be redeemed by people that had fallen out of favor, they could be denounced as counterfeit. This in particular was done by the Japanese government in the 1960s and 70s. All right. There's a famous series of bonds that the Japanese government did issue, but then later reneged on and said they were counterfeit. And the bonds were deliberately designed to look slightly different than official Japanese government securities. All right. Now, let's go back to Operation Bernhard. Operation Bernhard would have provided the post war Nazi International with a pool of expertise and technique in counterfeiting currency and in counterfeiting securities. And it's very interesting to note that Operation Bernhard was, at that time, the largest counterfeiting operation in history. I think, personally, that the size and scope of the bearer bonds forgery scandals that we've seen constantly emerging in the last 2 to 3 years, I think that the size and scope of this operation has now superseded Operation Bernhard. We are dealing with a large, well-funded, well-equipped, technically sophisticated operation in many cases with these bearer bond scandals. And that leads me to suggest that we may be dealing in part not only with the official governments that have been involved or implicated in these bearer bonds scandals, the Japanese government, very possibly the Chinese government, certainly the American government, and now with the recent revelations about the Filipino bearer bond scandal with Argentine peso notes, Japanese yen currency, and German government bonds, we very probably have messages being sent that all of these governments are somehow involved. And it was precisely that connection to Argentina and Germany in the latest version of the bearer bond scandal that suggested to me that we may be looking at yet another player involved in counterfeiting securities on a massive scale. Now, I think if we look at Operation Bernhard in this light, and tie it in with this hypothesis I've been developing in several books of a post-war extraterritorial fascist or Nazi state that is intricately linked to the financial and corporate elite of the West, that is intricately linked to the criminal underground drug trade that is intricately linked to the American military-industrial complex, certainly in the case of the paperclip scientists. I think if we look at Operation Bernhard in this respect, then we have to start considering the possibility that there may be an entity that was aware of this second tier of finance, not necessarily helping set it up, but was at least aware of its existence, because after all, the Nazis had to move all their loot into those Western banks, and that's been my hypothesis behind the Bilderberg meetings, and the intentions that they were set up for was to help coordinate laundering all that money between the post-war Nazi elite and the post-war Anglo-American corporate and banking elite. So Operation Bernhard, if we suppose for a minute the continuation of this operation after the war, they would have known of all this activity. They would have known also of the efforts of the post-war American intelligence community to use all of that Japanese gold that had been collected under Golden Lily and floating securities on the basis of this hidden bullion. So it's very possible that we're not looking just at one entity behind the current bearer bond scandals. So I'm taking issue with other researchers out there who are talking about the Dragon Family Trust and so on and so forth, who seem to be focused rather narrowly on, in my opinion, on just one possible scenario and one possible group of players behind all of this activity. I think we're looking at probably several players. We're looking at least at the involvement at some level of the Japanese government, possibly the imperial family in Japan, because after all, they still have a lot of that gold, they still know where a lot of it is, and so on and so forth. But we're also looking very probably at the Chinese and Chinese intelligence, which certainly knew about all of this gold. We're also looking at, if we factor in now, this idea that Operation Bernhard and all of this counterfeiting expertise survived the war and survived in Nazi hands. We're looking at yet another possible player involved in this activity and laundering their securities, most likely via the Vatican Bank and other banking contacts in Switzerland. We're looking at least three players involved in this activity besides the unofficial kind of private intelligence network run by the US government on the basis of this hidden system of finance that was put into place after World War II on the basis of the Operation Golden Lily funds. All right. So I think we're looking at several players. Total them all up, and we get about 5 different players that are all aware of this hidden tier of finance, number one. Number two, you've got counterfeiters involved that are definitely aware of it. And number three, you've got probably official securities out there that were deliberately minted or printed with errors or stylistic differences from the official public securities so that these could be denounced. All of this, I think, has to be taken into consideration when we look at the bearer bond scandal. Operation Bernhard would have been the first real official attempt of a government to enter into the counterfeiting racket in a major way. And there's no reason to suppose, contrary to most of the research that's been done on Operation Bernhard out there, there's no reason to suppose that they would have limited themselves simply to counterfeiting currency. As I say, the strategic evacuation plans of Nazi Germany from 1943 up to the end of the war and even after, those plans would have known and factored into their calculations something like Operation Bernhard. So it's very possible that they contributed in a major way to the circulation of counterfeit securities and to the creation of this hidden system of finance. Now, I grant you, and I want to make it very clear, I am not basing this on, as yet, any research that has led me to this conclusion. I am speculating on the basis of things that are out there and on the implications of what we already know about the Nazi strategic evacuation plans, about the capabilities of Operation Bernhard, and about the actual facts as they've been reported anyway about these different bearer bond scandals. It's interesting to note that the counterfeiting ring that the governments of the world have been dealing with appears to be rooted or centered in the Philippine Islands. And certainly this is an activity that goes back to the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos, who of course was eventually overthrown after he ran out of favor with the Reagan administration. So we'll pick up that part of the story in tomorrow's blog. So I'll see you on the flip side, folks. Bye-bye.